But many pharma companies, they are progressing on applying AI to the existing dysfunctional processes, right, or systems. So what AI does is it does not fix your broken processes. It amplifies that. So in the
Mm.
past, we had the element of business process reengineering, right, many years ago, where you had to study your process and then make the right change and then have the new process. Same thing with AI.
Welcome back to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Rondo Moses.
And I'm Matt Tice. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by disruption.
And in each episode, we explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in fast-changing markets.
You'll hear conversations, case studies, and insights from leaders who are applying these mindsets to thrive in this uncertain environment.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and check out our companion blogs at insurgentsgroup.com for a summary of takeaways from each episode. Let's get into the conversation, Matt.
All right, Rondo. So we have a great guest today. We haven't explored medtech and pharmaceutical yet on this podcast, so I've been looking forward to bringing Hitesh Vachharajani onto this call to share with us his experience. Hitesh has a really wide sort of lens for this industry, having worked in Indian generics and medtech, and as a product manager in various therapeutic areas, and currently working in what we'll hear about is a very interesting startup situation. So, Hitesh, come on board and let's get started. Great to see you, Hitesh. I've been looking forward to having you here and hearing your perspectives and getting a deep dive into this industry, which we really haven't had the opportunity to feature on the podcast.
Lovely to meet you, Matt and Rondo.
Looking forward to the chat.
So Hitesh, I think as a lead into our discussion, it would be great to hear your journey. So, we've sort of positioned you as an expert in pharma, medtech, and all
Yes.
things in this area. So, give us the Hitesh story and help us understand kind of your journey and where you started and where you're at now.
Okay. So, thank you for the introduction. I have been in the life sciences sector for about 27 years now, working across pharmaceuticals, medtech, and diagnostics. Uh, Most of my career has been in ANZ, India, the UK, and some parts in the US. I've worked for organizations like Abbott, 3M, Cipla, and Baxter Healthcare. Across the roles, I've managed strategy, M&A, portfolio management, operational transformation, and business process reinvention, for a better word. More recently, I'm working as a founder of an organization called Intellico, where we are partnering with clinicians and research institutions to develop a breath-based diagnostic for early detection of some disease states, focusing on neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's to start with. And then if we can prove that well, the next intention is to go to some cancers like lung, breast, and prostate cancer.
Outstanding, Hitesh. So that sounds really interesting. It'd be fun to hear a little bit more about how that all works. Before we dive into your current role and get into kind of some of the things you're doing as a founder, I'd love to hear you give us 100,000-foot overview of the whole industry. What's changing? Who's winning? What's disrupting the pharma, medtech, and diagnostic space across the ecosystem? And just give us Hitesh's view on, how to characterize the industry as it sort of turns now into the late 2020s.
So I'd kind of split them into generic pharma, innovative pharma, and medtech, right? I mean, and I'll talk to my experience. So in the generic pharma, the traditional growth approach has always been, wide distribution, low cost, and scale. Okay, and now that's the growth and value creation is gradually moving towards more complex generics, more injectables, more biosimilars, more hospital and specialty therapeutics. Supply reliability is becoming a very big element of trust and differentiation, and your ability to make the right choices with regards to capital allocation and portfolio discipline. So what you don't do becomes as important as what you do. So these are things that are going to change in the future and become more and more relevant. Uh, and so therefore the companies that are going to win in the future are not necessarily going to be the cheapest, but they are the ones who will adopt the insurgent mindset and play more on the lines of doing something radically different for a value creation, as opposed to the traditional pharma, which is still focusing on the y-axis, the doing more of what you're doing. By y-axis I mean where you play kind of. And in terms of the innovator side, while the focus has always been and continues to be on research and late stage clinical trials, I think where the emphasis and value creation will move more towards the future is going to be on the lines of comparative value versus the established practices.
Mm.
Evidence way beyond the trial, so trying to prove real world evidence as well, not just stopping at pharmacovigilance. Then getting into the a very good access strategy where you've got health technology assessments planned very early on in the clinical trials and not just waiting till the end for submission. And this is where many people have a problem in PBS and so on. And finally, focusing on the total system economics, so the hospital adoption, patient adherence, and the likes. So this is how I think the emphasis will change. In the medtech side, the two sectors. One is the innovator side where you've got implantable, orthopedics and heart valves and neurology products, and on the other hand, you've got the consumables. So the consumables are like your, gloves and gowns and so on. So those will remain commodities. Price volume will play a role, and the focus there is more about environmental sustainability. So there was a lot more products that were used that were going to the landfill, and now that's becoming. But many companies are doing that. So again, the future will be on scale and volume and price. In the innovator side, it'll be more about uh, clinical fit. It'll be more about by clinical fit, I mean it doesn't cause any more friction. It doesn't come in the way of their workflows, and hopefully helps them to do things more efficiently, save time, save costs, and so on. But the key element is clinical and workflow fit. That means it doesn't add to any friction and actually makes the life of the clinicians a lot better and helps them to achieve better patient outcomes. So if these things can be done, some of it is already being done, but I think there'll be a greater emphasis of this in the future. So this is how I see the industry, where it's come from and sort of where it's going. AI, of course, is playing a big role in machine
Mm.
learning across various sectors, and I see that as a horizontal force that is going to impact just about every sector of pharmaceuticals, be it procurement, every area of the value chain, right from manufacturing, the back office functions, finance, HR, marketing, etc. The front end, AI in MarTech is already becoming big. In fact, I'm doing a postgraduate course right now on the sidelines just because I grew up in traditional marketing and the world is very different right now. So I think these things offer exciting possibilities for the patients and the payers because in a country like Australia, the Medicare costs are going through the roof, and why they tax us quite a lot. They simply can't tax us anymore. On the other hand, they're going to find ways where they can find more effective and high quality clinical care, but at a cost that is easily affordable to the system.
I'm glad you brought that up, Hitesh. I think it'd be interesting to understand, and then I'll flip it to you, Rondo, to understand a little bit better some of the external forces on the industry and how, particularly different regulatory regimes are dealing with, affordability, which is a significant problem. And, certainly one of the big problems of our age, sort of, we
Sure,
only need to just look to the UK and see how much pressure that system is under.
sure.
And, I suppose that and you mentioned AI, and I think it'd be interesting if you could develop that a little bit with some examples of where people are winning or where some of that investment's going, because
Sure,
obviously
sure,
it's a huge open field.
sure. So I'll answer all the three. One is the trends, one is the elements of affordability, and look at AI. So in terms of external trends, uh, broadly things haven't changed very dramatically. So the things impacting the health system as a whole, you have the large impact coming from the increasing chronic burden and aging population, and that's adding tremendous pressure to the health systems, both in terms of cost and also workforce burnout and so on. The second area that's adding complexity is this whole digitalization. So and therefore the people are really struggling with interoperability, cybersecurity, privacy, even learning, because and having uniform systems across different systems, right? So New South Wales Health, for example, is undertaking a major initiative to standardize their records. I remember many years ago when I was admitted to Blacktown Hospital and I had to go to Westmead. The systems wouldn't talk to each other, so we took a big file as big as Encyclopedia Britannica to Westmead in a paper file, and took it there because even though they are a part of the same health system, now that will change. And the third area is sustainability. Sustainability, both from a financial standpoint as well as from an environmental standpoint. And while hospitals are acutely aware of things like carbon footprint and so on, there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. So these are the three broad areas, the aging population and the chronic disease burden, the massive changes coming through digitization of healthcare, and the way healthcare is dealing with it. And the third part is sustainability from a financial and an environmental standpoint. Coming to the component of affordability, uh, you know, people have tried traditional approaches. So, there are different. So, if I take Australia, different approaches to procurement. And please bear in mind, I'm telling you my side of the reality. On the drug side, you have organizations like the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee through the PBS. They have a very thorough and well established system to look at the added clinical value from health economic models for drugs to then decide what goes on PBS, what doesn't. And this is where many companies, uh, while you might see a lot in the media around, people blaming the PBS for delays and so on, the fact is that it is a capability problem as much as a PBS problem. PBS has a very advanced access system and it's a difficult environment. But I think if companies can start building these health technology assessment capabilities, they'll be a lot more successful. And this model, if applied to other places like you mentioned, UK or Europe or even the US, would, I believe, produce very good results. Maybe some tweaking around by different countries. Uh, in the medtech side, they have the MSAC, the body that looks at pricing for medical products, especially implantables and so on. Consumables are largely procured through a tender-based procurement, and they generally take the value out of the equation. Everybody meets the same standards, so then it becomes a price-volume equation. I think what people are gradually trying to realize is that uh, simply trying to push suppliers very heavily on price alone is not helping. uh, Supply reliability is becoming a very, very crucial uh, benefit, not just for the companies that are selling into, but for the hospitals itself. Because once you don't get a critical product and a major case gets missed out, it creates a havoc in the system. Not to mention there are medical legal challenges, the patient suffers and so on. So I think especially in generics and even in the innovator side, this reliability of supply will become a crucial. So operational excellence will translate into some sort of a commercial advantage. Uh, the third point you mentioned was, I'm sorry, I lost it. One was AI.
Just
Sorry,
developing AI
AI.
examples
Yes.
that
So I think this is where the insurgents mindset and what I'm about to say is very much my personal opinion. But many pharma companies, they are progressing on applying AI to the existing dysfunctional processes, right, or systems. So what AI does is it does not fix your broken processes. It amplifies that. So in the
Mm,
past, we had the element of business process reengineering, right? Many years ago, where you had to study your process and then make the right change and then have the new process. Same thing with AI. So for example, you could be using AI, to design a better call planning for a territory structure and a sales team, which was designed for the past, right? Or using conversational AI to automate the conversation that the rep is having with the doctor. But is that what the doctor wants? Okay. Or are using AI to create medical content faster on things like Perplexity? Uh, you know, so this is on the other hand. So this is what I would call using AI for more of the y-axis stuff. On the x-axis stuff where you want to radically do things differently for value creation. Some applications of AI could be where you could use AI to completely get rid of the rep model and do something different in select therapeutic areas. The second area I think where AI can make a big role, and this is where I am studying right now, is the engagement of healthcare professionals through digital channels, where AI can predict through various signals the entire stage of right from activation, engagement, retention, monetization, and service, and look at things like churn prediction and so on. And this can make a radical impact there. The other areas could be, supply chain, where you can radically improve your forecasting accuracies, which can have an impact on not just your bottom line, but also customer satisfaction and so on. So I think the key question, in my opinion, that you need to ask for AI is: Are you using AI to help you do things better and faster, automate repetitive tasks, with the hope that the people who are doing the jobs will then be able to focus on the higher order tasks, which is a good initiative? Or do you want to use AI to do something that you could never do before?
Mm.
So one is efficiency, the other one is strategy. And I think that's where AI will make a radical impact. Now, to be fair, it's a huge change, right? Like we had a change in the industrial era, we had a change in the internet era. I think AI is becoming bringing a massive change in multiple areas, just that this quantum and the speed of that change is much faster. So it's a huge learning curve for a lot of people as well, and all of us are learning, including myself. So no one intentionally makes mistakes. So, but I think the approach to insurgents, if that can be used for applying AI. So, in the earlier example I gave, if you can fix your commercial model first, then look at where AI can help you, you can get radical changes. So, don't let the AI consulting firm decide what you should be doing. Be in control of your business in a better way. Maybe they can help you, and then decide where this becomes a good enabler. Otherwise, you could land up a lot of. So, leadership has to play a key role in integration across uh, cross functions to make sure that you become more customer relevant in the age of AI. The benefits are very obvious, efficiency and satisfaction and innovation and production and cost savings, and you name it. I mean, there are so many case studies across the board. But I think if we apply the insurgent mindset before you apply AI, that could be a radical change. That will be the right way to get a better bang for your buck. By that I mean the investment in the AI.
Hmm. Hmm. But Hitesh, how do you square that with the reports? Like, for example, in the US, for example, only 10% of CEOs say that they're getting the value that they expected from AI at this point in the game. They may be getting some savings, but they're not really getting the productivity lift that they expected from AI, and they're investing a lot. So how do you, is that because they're not doing the radical thinking about how do they think about this problem differently, and then in the context of AI, as opposed to trying to do what they do today and do it faster or do it better?
So, and I must say I don't have a very thorough understanding of their circumstances, right? So, but my from whatever I've read, from published reports, internet, McKinsey, etc. My high level assessment is that they've gone in very quickly with an efficiency play, with the promises made. For example, you bring in AI agents, and they will automatically save X amount of cost, right? Human being versus this, and there are so many agencies that do that, and maybe there is a value in doing in some repetitive tasks, but to bring a radical change at a business level where you're going to do something totally different, change the world kind of thing, there I think it almost requires taking a step back and doing a lot of strategic thinking on the insurgents lines to say where is the world going, and how is the customers needs and profiles changing, and how are we going to be relevant. uh, and I think that sometimes may or may not have happened. And in the absence
Hmm.
of that, it just becomes another tool that you bring in,
Hmm.
and there's a big fanfare because nowadays everywhere, look at internet, AI seems to be the place. Everyone's talking about AI, but then you don't derive. So what needs to happen is when you go in there, you need to have a clear roadmap with very clear analytics attached to that, to say how are we going to measure success at every stage, and how will we pivot, and in the process, how do we ensure that we make enough mistakes that are not very expensive. So learn fast, fail fast, not learn slow and expensively. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
there's a component of insurgent thinking, there's a component of business model innovation, there's a component of performance and analytics side of things, and regular tweaking and agility. So these competencies haven't changed over the years. It's just about how do we apply it in the context of AI. So a critical element would be to say where in my organization will AI add value and
Yeah.
where not. And so therefore, where do I start? Should be organization wide, should be a few functions, and how do I measure that? Because unless you can show early wins, you don't establish that credibility with your stakeholders. And eventually it just fizzles out. Here comes another. There's a saying in Australia, they call it the Bohica syndrome, bend over, here it comes again. So that kind of thing, here's another fact. But having seen the potential of machine learning in my startup at the product development side, in the way I am convinced on the potential of AI in the manufacturing, in the supply chain operation side. As I'm now involved in the martech side of things, I'm convinced that it has a lot of role to play. It's just almost like taking a helicopter view before you, that balance of the telescope and microscope. If you just go straight into the activity mode, it can create pain in the sense you don't derive the benefits, and then you don't know who to blame, right? Is it the AI the problem, or is it my people the problem, or was consultant who made lots of money and then I was a loser, that kind of thing. So yeah,
I think my experience has been so far that I'm finding that organizations are still experimenting, sort of like having employees use AI to in their roles and figure out how it can work for them. But there's not a lot of strategic sort of
yes,
coordination of where the problems that to your earlier point about commercialization, for example,
yes,
that we really want to focus AI on it. And I also think that the issue is that they're going into these conversations with how do we use it within the context of how we're doing things today, as opposed to here's
yes,
the problem. And now that we have this tool, how do we
yes.
solve this problem with this tool as sort of the guide for how we would solve it, right? As
That's
opposed to
exactly right.
taking and doing what we're doing today and just doing it in AI, you know?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I think that's why I said the insurgent thinking, having a radically different approach to value creation. Uh, and Matt has spoken a lot about business model innovation and getting those facts right, and then saying how does AI help me to get there. And there are a lot of ways by which AI can help you, but it's almost like you don't put the cart before the horse. It's almost you find a purpose, the means will follow,
Hmm.
not the other way around.
Now,
Hitesh, some really, oh,
the
go
other thing
ahead,
I
brother.
just want to ask you is because I started my career in the pharmaceutical industry many years ago, before
Yes,
you did actually,
yes,
and on the innovative side. So I worked
yes,
for it was SmithKline and French when I joined them
yes,
many years ago. Now GlaxoSmithKline,
yes,
and one of the things that we've observed over the years is that that same model is pretty much stuck, right?
yes,
Although managed care, when it came out in the late 80s, early 90s, it
yes,
sort of pushed the emphasis to the payers, et cetera. And
yes,
now a lot more emphasis on specialty drugs as opposed
yes,
to, the tried and true long-standing drugs and
yes,
generics. But the model is itself is pretty much
yes,
intact. Are
yes.
you seeing any disruptive forces in pharma and from your experience where there's a lot more talk about how do we change the model of pharma itself, the business model of pharma itself?
So majority of the companies that I know of are doing exactly what you said. So many years ago, when I started in pharma, the sales rep had a visual aid, which is a paper device, and he used to flip the page, and the
Yeah.
poor doctor on the other side is getting bored to death, and here the fellow studied pharmacology, and here comes the rep telling him, aspirin is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and this is what you shall be doing, and that guy switched off, right? Now what do? You come in with an iPad, right? Same damn thing. And instead of flipping the page, you press a button and the iPad flips the page, right? The hope is that the same conversation. Now, of course, in iPads, with videos and all that stuff, you can make it a little more interactive. And I'm not saying it's not working, but the fundamental approach hasn't changed. Or using KOLs to influence, the broader group of people, early adopters. That hasn't changed much. Where there'll be more face-to-face lectures nowadays. You also have webinars because that brings about, efficiencies. You can reach more people. So that's where the digital. But that has been also happening for the last 15, 20 years. In terms of your question about what are people doing things differently, I've seen two examples, three examples actually, where people are looking at doing some things differently, and I haven't seen the results in all of them myself, so I can't say they are necessarily working. So on one hand, I've seen pharma companies that are using conversational AI very well to
Mm.
to communicate with the doctor and understand how that healthcare communication, based on signals that AI can predict, is giving them the right kind of communication that is also compliant with what the regulators want. Okay, and to that extent, it is becoming more customized, and the doctor gets the right information at the right time with regards to your product, but in a way and form and time that he wants, right? So there's a lot more engagement there. On the pharmaceutical manufacturing side, I've seen people using tools like fully controlled continuous manufacturing, especially in
Hmm.
biosimilars, where AI has a very big role to play. Where basically what you're doing is you're reducing the factory footprint, right? So you're reducing the fixed costs. So the entire journey that you go from granulation and tableting and to the selling is now cut down. You're going from many steps to a fewer steps, and that causes a radical change in your cost of goods sold. What that means is you become a little more competitive in areas like biosimilars, which is not just a price game but a change management game as well. But at least on the pricing side, you can manage things a lot better. Uh, Similarly, some people are using the supply chain side quite well, for forecasting accuracies and so on. Although because traditionally most pharma companies have used some of the other software for supply chain prediction, which is largely some sort of a statistical model that extrapolates the past, and then you have some manual input being put in to say, I think we're going to sell more or less, and that's also sometimes a toss of a coin, because when you win a tender, for example, in New South Wales, where it's multi-listing, being on a tender becomes a hunting license, right? So you don't know whether you're going to get 10 major hospitals or 5 major hospitals. And to that extent, the demand forecasting gets challenging. So, apart from that, the other area I found is some companies are doing radically different things in the healthcare engagement piece, where the medical affairs teams are really stepping up and into what they call medico marketing, and finding innovative ways to communicate with the doctors. And this move actually picked up during the COVID times, where the traditional rep was not allowed to meet the doctor for obvious reasons, and people were forced to start thinking differently about how. And that's where I feel the medical affairs is now becoming more and more of a strategic function, and they're doing some very very innovative things. Uh, in Australia, I know there are some companies that have tried to do the radical thing by getting rid of sales reps completely in some of their divisions and replace that totally with a digital model, and they are also learning along the way. So it's not very easy, because not easy for the doctor, not easy for the companies, because you've always grown up in a certain way, you're used to doing a certain thing. So learning a different way of doing things and trying to achieve success with that also requires a bit of a mindset shift and
Right.
acceptance from the seniors of a lack of fear of failure kind of thing, right? uh,
Yeah.
what I've also found some companies do very well is use this component of what I call companion diagnostics. So they will, people who can look at the diagnostic flow early on can then be in a better position to control the therapeutic flow subsequently. So there are companies like, say, Roche, for example, they're doing a very smart thing where they're investing very well in the diagnostic side. The idea is early detection can lead to early cure, or early detection can lead to early trials. So you get the right cohort of patients for pharmaceutical trials, and therefore you can go to treatment much faster. So there are people, and this is the limited information I have. It could very well be that there's a lot more change that has happened in the last 2 3 years, because in the last 2.5 years I've been heavily involved in my own startup. So uh,
Hmm.
I've been a little bit out of that day-to-day corporate world. But from whatever I hear from my friends, or the associations that I have with the Australian Institute of Company Directors and so on, and I'm an alumni of the Melbourne Business School, and catch up with people there. You hear things, and this is what I'm gathering. Everybody's keen to make an impact and use AI in the right way. Of course, there's a bit of fear around jobs and all that, but I think people need hand holding in that concept. And pharmaceuticals is a little more, or medtech is a little more specialized, given the regulatory nature of the business and the extent to which the regulators also control, uh, to some extent, the communication that goes out to doctors and nurses and so on.
Hmm.
Hitesh, it seems a lot like often in these established industries which have a high regulatory moat, a lot of the innovation comes from the edges, right? So you mentioned, or at least alluded to a little bit, and I think it's sort of be remiss of all of us not to talk about, the healthcare ecosystem without going downstream and thinking about the patient for a minute. Um,
Yes.
Hmm.
I guess sort of where patient meets platform, you have the open evidence and Heidi's of the world who are kind of bridging that gap somehow. So I think that's really interesting. Another thing I'd love you to comment on is sort of you work all the way back upstream. And Rondo and I have talked about this numerous times. We're big fans of the Moonshot book, and during COVID with kind of the time to market compression for these big programs. There's an assumption that that time to market will be compressed forever. I just wonder on if we look at both ends of the value chain, right, and start to think about,
Yes.
because if we think about those as the edges, right? So the holy
Yes.
grail in pharma is to significantly compress that time
Time.
to market,
Yes.
right? And I guess the holy grail for, at the other end of the value chain is to create a much closer relationship with the patient and to create much more um, uh, streamlined patient access. So
Yes.
I think like if we look at Moonshot, where we had the COVID vaccine and presumably that sort of created a lot of disruption in terms of the art of the possible in the industry. But then on
Yes.
the other end, you have the open evidences and the Heidis of the world doing what is really interesting, creating point of care engagement, which never existed before. I'd love you to hear your thoughts on those two major issues.
So, on the element of patient engagement and the point of care, I think that is going to be a major change. I do believe that the modern technologies in machine learning, which in turn is facilitating things like precision medicine and proteomics, especially in areas like cancer, autoimmune diseases, and so on, will dramatically shift diagnosis away from the specialist clinic to the community or even the patient's home. Uh, we are already seeing dramatic changes in wearable devices. And as I was doing incubator programs as part of my startup with Founders Institute or Cicada Innovation out here, there were at least 15 students in my cohort who were doing radically different things on patient monitoring and so on, and in very simple ways. So that is going to be a major, major change. And I think that will be very good for the system in terms of early detection. Therefore, early treatment will also save, the system a lot of money. So there's a patient benefit, speed of treatment, so that the care will go eventually more and more from the hospital to the community and to the patient. And the governments are also investing very heavily in that area. UK right now is experimenting on a big model of what they call integrated care model, where they have they're trying to align the systems with the hospitals and the specialist care and the community care to make sure that the patient gets quicker. Prevention becomes much better and easier, and that way what happens is you have largely non-invasive approaches that improve access, that improve costs, that and this becomes particularly important in the rural areas where they don't have access to specialty therapies. In my own area, where we are focusing on Alzheimer's, when I was doing research with neurologists and so on, uh, you know, Australia has about 630 neurologists. We need close to 3,000, right? Most of these people are focused in the cities. Rural areas, the quality of treatment and everything is very poor. So these new technologies now permit that, and that coupled with telemedicine means that the doctor sitting in Sydney can still provide the kind of care to the people sitting out there. So there's an element of access, equity, and cost. These are the clear advantages, and you'll see more of that happening, driven by these changes. Another major change that's driving this is the intersection of various disciplines, partly also driven by the lack of funding from the governments in Australia, not so much in the US, in research, not lack of funding, but reduced amount of, and that is forcing different people to collaborate with each other. So in real examples, I saw a major institution in Sydney that is really big on genomics would never talk to somebody in Western Sydney because, the people in the eastern suburbs are the gods and the people out here are, you know, and they realize that these chaps are real experts in proteomics. But what was realized is that when you combine, the data from proteomics feeds into genomics, which then leads to, faster outputs for precision medicine. And you could go from something like 8 to 10 weeks to as much as 6 or 7 days. Now, add to that companies like Enable in the US, which are working on areas like spatial biology, which is basically having AI scientists, data scientists who are helping clinicians and experts in all these areas to radically create quicker diagnosis and quicker cure for not just cancers, but autoimmune diseases in many, many areas. And the possibilities become dramatic. Again, everybody, because they know that health systems are under a price pressure, everyone's trying to see if they can take it away from the hospital to the extent to the specialist or to the community center, ideally to the patient, so that access and cost become better. So in the next 3 to 4 years' time, you'll see a radical shift. In terms of platforms, that's the way things are going to go more and more, partly also because investors love platform. The valuations of platforms are better. I myself am doing that. I'm focusing on Alzheimer's. Next thing is Parkinson's. The next three are lung cancer, breast, and prostate cancer, because eventually when I want to exit, I want to, sell a platform as opposed to just a product. Now, coming on the point of, you mentioned. Sorry, what was the second question you asked? One was
I was interested about in the upstream, thinking about sort of the time to market compression.
yes, yes.
You know,
So
what we learned from COVID with the Pfizer vaccine and
yes,
all of that, to what extent now when that meets up with AI and some of the transformation that you mentioned,
exactly right.
does that give pharma, med tech, et cetera, an opportunity to
Yes,
significantly
yes,
compress the
yes.
cycle
And
time?
so during COVID, some of the speed came because of the excellent work companies like Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca did at multiple levels to compress that time. And they were also backed by some things like presidential immunity and so on. So that helped them, which was not available to companies in the past. But now what is dramatically changing are a couple of things. One is there's a lot of digital healthcare tools for recruitment of patients, and this
Mhm.
happened during COVID for clinical trials. Okay, and what happens is uh, that this will dramatically change the time it takes to recruit patients. Otherwise the traditional approach is you reach out to people and on your database and so on and so forth. Uh, and in fact, I know of a professor in Melbourne, in Monash, who's pioneering this concept, and there is a lot more work happening in Europe and US in this regards. The second area is the clinical trial itself. There's a lot of work happening, and there are at least 5 companies that I know, and one in Australia that's doing radical work in the field of using different forms of machine learning to speed up elements of clinical trials. So a lot of the work that's required in data capture, analysis, and all of that is being dramatically, speeded up. Even various decisions in the process uh, are being taken care of in a good way, and now regulators are obviously looking at that to say, how do we enable the faster speed. On the other side, if you look at it, when I started when I finished pharmacology, after medicine, it used to take 7 to 8 years plus for a new drug to come out to the market. By the time you discover new chemicals and molecules and you go through the full process of preclinical studies and, phase one, phase two, and so on. Nowadays, what is happening is with generative AI, and there are at least 4 companies already, large ones in the US, that are doing this in a big way, where you can start discovering molecules uh, in an almost customized way in seconds and minutes, not months or years. And so you can put in, so there's something called a structure activity relationship where you have chemical structures, these drugs, whether it's a chemical or a biological agent. And some of these will cause some side effects and so on. So based on what you know already, it's almost like giving ChatGPT a prompt. I'm giving a very simple example to say, I want you to create a drug that gives me all these benefits, a molecule, but does not have all these side effects. But by the way, it's better, faster, cheaper. Based on everything I saw in PubMed, these guys, had all these challenges in clinical trial. Can you also make sure? And these tools, within a day or so, will give you not one or two, but 4 or 5 molecules. Now, then there's a second area of AI-driven development where they have got these digital models and robotic simulations where they're no longer doing animal studies. So the entire preclinical studies are being done in the lab using actual human, tissue as the simulations. So one, you're killing less animals, or hopefully there's a time where you won't kill animals, but you're dramatically compressing that preclinical time. So when you add all these things together, the time to discovery, the time to, preclinical studies being compressed, the time for clinical trials being compressed, uh, you know, then there is a lot of collaboration now across various regulators, uh, the TGA, the FDA, the UK EMA, sorry, the UK MHRA and the European EMA, where they're trying to, because it's a challenge for everybody to know how exactly to regulate healthcare. So there's a lot of collaboration happening where they're all learning from each other. At the moment, largely from the US, because that's where a lot of these new devices are being launched. But they're also trying to share workload and things like that. But the idea is that these people are also looking at models of how AI can help them, to approve things a lot faster. And the US is leading the pack here, where innovators can get to market a lot faster. The patients can see the benefits a lot faster. The health system, the payers in Australia or the insurance companies in the US, for example, can derive the benefits at a much better cost point. And so a combination of all these things in the next, and you will start, I think we'll start seeing these benefits in as little as 3 to 5 years, where these massive changes will start happening. And so I'm very excited about various elements, not to mention massive changes happening through blockchain on supply chain, or the application of AI in HR or finance, or marketing and so on. And so the way all these things come together, what this means is, from a human resource perspective, you'll need a different set of people, or people need to be upskilled or trained, and the approach to leadership and the mindsets of how things will evolve in the AI world will also have to be different. No textbooks are written for this right now.
Hitesh, that's a great pivot as we kind of come to the end a little bit. Would be great to hear your thoughts about how you're applying this mindset as a founder in your
Yeah.
company, but also what you've learned in your experience, given all of this disruptive change you've just described. What are some of the lessons that you might impart to leaders looking to explore this broad field and ecosystem?
So I would say uh, everybody should have an insurgent mindset, even though you are an incumbent. So what am I doing in my startup? You know, it was tough to get grants when I started off, right? Uh, Especially when you're not collaborating with the university. Because I'm working with a group here called Design Momentum, which is the design lab that's developing my product. And the reason I didn't go with some universities is they wanted 60% equity upfront. If you give 60% equity upfront, you don't have a company. Nobody then invests in your company in the subsequent stages. So that's a different issue in the US and UK, where people are a lot more. But so customer proximity was the first one. So in my case, the entire product design came out of market research. So I personally interviewed over 300 neurologists, people from the payer group, regulators, various clinicians. I spent a lot of time in aged care centers that are specializing for dementia care, like Hammond Care in Australia, trying to understand the life of not just the patient but the family, the funding mechanisms, what's broken in the system. It's really bad to have Alzheimer's uh, in many ways, not just for the patient, for the families, for the systems, and it's now, of course, it's catching the attention because it's a huge cost for the government as well. So that customer proximity then becomes a starting point to say what gets designed into my product, not the other way around. So when I was doing these incubator programs, many of my students would be PhD students in the lab. And when I had the chance to speak to some of their professors, they'll say, well, who gives a, why are you wasting your time with customers? We design the lab, we are the smart people, we'll design something and they will buy from us. Okay, Steve Jobs succeeded with that, and Apple, I don't think everybody will. Maybe I'm a bit old fashioned, but to me, the starting point was always the customers. That proximity also helps you not only get close, but then you understand where the focus of power, where the focus of decision making lies, and how you're going to make money along the way. The second thing is, looking at cost, because you're bootstrapping here. Sometimes you're a one. When I started off, it was a one man army. So variabilizing cost structures, right? So I have an ecosystem of people who are in accounting, legal side, intellectual property, regulatory strategy, clinical strategy, uh, and you name it. There's a whole draft, about 18 different consultants. And these people are not on my books, but they are helping me on a case by case basis. But the best thing is that these consultants are not just saving me costs, but they are actually bringing me best practices. And that's the biggest benefit that I'm finding of these consultants. So I am not, and this is clearly something that, say, pharma companies can easily do. You can outsource pharmacovigilance, RA, QA to the right partner, as long as it fits with your strategy and so on. Because there are enough people out there now, enough softwares that do that job better than what any human being can do. uh, in terms of finding competitors, attacking the weaker praise, focusing on consistently upskilling your capabilities. So classic insurgent mindset is you're trying to extract more from the core, better, faster, cheaper, that kind of thing. Whereas here, it's a totally different mindset, partly driven by the fact that my survival depends on that. So, if I don't do something differently, uh, I won't be relevant to the customers, and I won't be relevant to the payers. If I don't get both of the people on board, I won't have anything to sell. Of course, there's a regulatory piece, but that's given. Everybody knows that you need regulatory approval before you can sell in pharma or medtech. Or health economic logic is becoming very crucial. So if you have the end goal in mind and you start working not just on the innovation piece coming from these customer feedback, but also look at how is it going to add clinical value very early on in your design and in your clinical trial, then your ability to succeed at the payer stage becomes that much better and that much faster. To that extent, some countries I feel are doing a better job where we can learn from. Like, for example, in Netherlands, they have a different form of Medicare where they've outsourced Medicare, their version of Medicare, to about 10 private insurance companies, right? The government pays the premium for that. The patients can subscribe to any one of those private insurance companies, healthcare insurance companies. They manage the hospitals and they are incentivized on patient satisfaction, customer satisfaction. So, uh, and because these insurance companies want to save costs, they are one of the first people who will support you for taking your innovation on board, right? So, you know, this is where I think the insurgent mindset, but the same mindset can easily be applied in a large established organization as well. So, having the insurgent mindset while you want to remain an incumbent uh, and using in AI in the future or machine learning to enable that will be a key determinant along the way, of course, the human resource side, upskilling and so on.
So just one last question, Hitesh. I'd love to, so clearly the insurgent sort of approach has become part of your way of thinking about your business and competition and so forth. I'd love to hear just your thoughts on what do you think some of the main sort of insights that you've taken out of that framework, and just as a summary, if you want to share it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on,
So,
yeah, how that.
when I first got exposed to this model, the insurgent model, uh, the y-axis being where you play and x-axis being how you play, and the classical incumbents, I could relate to that because this is exactly what we were doing, whether I was at 3M or whatever organization I was at. And you know while we had heard about things like business model innovation and things, we just didn't know what to do about it, or we were not doing enough about it because the day-to-day pressures were taking over what was really relevant. So, a concerted approach towards trying to say, what does it take to have a different form of a different recipe for value creation? How are we going to, and what that the simple answer to that is be close to your customer and have a very good mapping of all your customers. uh, it's not just the end users, but the influencers, the choosers, the payers, the providers, and get this is in the healthcare context. I'm saying get an overall context of how is the workflow and the fit and the economic value of your product going to happen in the context of this big ecosystem, and how will you then become relevant? And that is an ongoing process. So, early on, a great habit that Abbott, my first company in pharmaceuticals, that imbibed in me was you were out in the field for 3 days in a week, right? Out with the reps, and not just reps. They took it one step further, where the people in the back end would go and meet their counterparts in hospitals. Okay, so a supply chain manager in Abbott would go and meet the head of supply chain of a larger hospital group, and so on and so forth. And so you start really embedding yourself in the customer, and the kind of insights you get there and the pulse you develop, uh, that becomes that's how you develop the insurgent DNA. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, and I genuinely, as I've said this to you before, that every MBA school should have your textbook as a because it is a discipline that I feel. Today you have AI, tomorrow something else will come. These are tools, but the approach, the thought process, that y and x axis, simple in itself, but very hard to institutionalize. And if you do it well, the results are radical. If you don't do it well, as I said, you're using AI to automate call planning for a false structure, or that structure that's no longer relevant today, or the doctor who doesn't look at, and so you're automating a wrong process then. So if you get that customer element right, then you are very ruthless in your prioritization about where to play and how to win. These are the essential tenets of the insurgent mindset that will not just be required by every founder or startup, but also equally important for the larger organization. If that means radically changing your organization or being different, or as I said, one company here has taken a bold step of getting rid of all the sales reps and using AI-driven tools and maybe they take a while, but I think these pioneers will get success in the future.
Mm.
Very good. Thank you so much, Hitesh. It's been great to have you
Awesome.
on the podcast. It's
Thank you, Matt.
been a very both very broad but very narrow in terms of your comments, and I think your wealth of experience certainly shows through, and I'm sure our listeners will certainly appreciate your key lessons, both as you know uh, a senior manager in what you describe as a large incumbent and as a challenger founder. So we wish you all the success in the future and hope to have you on again.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Absolutely.
Matt. Thanks, Rondo.